Hello, everyone. My name is Keri Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove and co-founder of Studymove, and it's an absolute pleasure to connect with you today. I really appreciate that you are joining this key data update of April 2026. And I know that things are very, very busy, so we really, really appreciate the opportunity to connect. Today we had a very interesting session. We know that it has been quite a few changes in the dynamics of the market. In particular, universities have been reporting some shifts, and we want to share with you a lot of the data that we have been collecting and basically trying just to get a better understanding of what's happening in this space. So as I said, we had a very interesting session, and if that's okay, probably I will just jump on it. And I'm just gonna start sharing my screen so we can just get into it, okay? So let me just share my slides, and here we go. Perfect, excellent. So once again, I really, really appreciate the opportunity to connect. This is our first key data update of April 2026. We have another key data update coming up in 2 days. I will tell you more about it soon. But this one in particular is really looking at this set of challenges that we have seen are emerging, and in particular affecting universities in this first half of the year. We have noticed, and this has been something that, to be honest, we haven't seen before, that market conditions are shifting, but more quickly than ever before. We knew in the past, things have changed, student preferences change, policy framework has been changing significantly, but the pace of the change is something that I think is getting the attention of the sector. And for that reason, we thought it was important just to look into the numbers and trying to get a better sense of what's happening, and in particular, how these changes may be affecting the sector. Now, for us at Studymove, every year we have a mission of the company. So every year we really trying to identify something that it will be the core aspect of what we will do to support the sector year by year. And for us in 2026, it has been about supporting, in particular, universities, but in fact, the sector, just to pivot to an ongoing changing environment. And we're very pleased and we're extremely thankful for all your support. It has been really, really great just to get a lot of universities on board with the work that we have been doing. We have been doing a lot of specific analysis from big projects, for small projects, and for, in general, the higher education sector. And we actually have been finalizing our Studymove data reports that in particular has a lot of valuable information to understand all about the changes, in particular on how universities are adapting to the new environment of 2026. We have been doing a lot of work in understanding changes in fees. We're actually going to have a session on that on Thursday, but changes on scholarships, changes in domestic fees, changes on entry requirements. So it has been a lot of change, and we feel very, very happy just to see that we are assisting the sector just to understand what has been the change. And once again, we really, really appreciate the response from the sector, and we are more than happy just to really help you. And as I said, our mission in 2026 is really just to support everybody in this change that we are all facing. And because we have been collecting a lot of data, we have also complementing this collection of data with looking into detail of the information that is in the public domain, things of how commencements are changing, enrollments, markets, and how the development on student grant visas and student rejection visas, all that has been our priority, and we have been looking into it in close detail. And today we want to really share with you some of that analysis that we have been putting together on a weekly basis, pretty much. As I said, the question that we would like to answer today is exactly that. We noticed that it has been a shift in market conditions. We noticed that it has been very quickly. But at the end of the day, what we really want to understand is how is that affecting the higher education sector? And on that note, I just want to underline that the information that we will present today is mainly about higher education sector. I wish I could look at the other sectors in each session, but it's very, very hard because as we know in Australia, every subsector, like the vocational sector, the ELICA sector, are actually in a very different spot. So it's important that we just narrow the analysis in a particular sector. And today we're just going to focus on the higher education sector. But we acknowledge that trends in other sectors is actually quite different. Okay? All right. So in order to look at this particular analysis, we're actually going to divide the presentation in two main areas. The particular is that the first one is we're going to look in more close detail into the 2025 results that they were recently published by the Australian government. We previously had a look into that, but now that all the information is there, I think it's important just to look because there are some valuable lessons on what 2025 was for the higher education sector. So we're going to take a little bit of time on that. And I think there are some very interesting insights for everybody. And from there, we're actually going to look at the most recent data on 2026. And you're trying just to get a better sense of where is this shift coming from and where is this volatility and how universities are actually or maybe responding to this change in the market. So there is a lot of great information, and I really hope that this analysis that we are sharing with you complement your own views, your own institutional analysis. What we will present today is obviously the aggregate view of the sector, but we know that institutions will be facing different paths, different opportunities, and of course, different challenges. So this is just really to complement what you are actually doing in your own institutional, from your institutional perspectives. All right. Let me start with 2025. And I really want to highlight that I think it's very important to look at 2025. Sometimes, more recently, actually, I have noticed that there is this feeling in the sector that anything that is in the past is not relevant. Let's just move on. We're actually going so quickly that what everybody wants is, okay, no, tell me about 2026. So tell me about what's going to happen in 2027. We really need to spend a little bit of time revisiting what happened in the past to get a little bit of perspective. And I think that's the reason why I just want to take a little bit of time in looking at 2025. Now, as we all know, in 2025, probably the main story of 2025 is that we will still be facing a restrictive set of policies from the Australian government. Overall, the same set of policies that they were implemented in 2024, they were implemented and probably in a more solid way in 2025. This was a restrictive set of policies looking for a managed growth strategy. And at the center of it, it was the allocation of NOSC for education providers and Ministerial Direction 111. We did have also a few things, like, for example, in July 2025, we have another increase in student visas, in the cost of student visas. But overall, more or less, it has been the same set of policies. Now, what I think is important to highlight is the actual result that the higher education sector had that year in 2025. If we look at the historical number of international student commencements year by year, and I'm just going to share with you, as you know, I like to look at this often. We had our pre-pandemic peak in 2019. Then we had the dip during COVID. And then in 2025, we actually experienced an increase of 1% compared to the previous year. We actually reached 214,000 international student commencements in higher education. And I just want to take a little bit of time looking at this because I do think that this is a remarkable result, considering the level of uncertainty that we had in the market and considering that we were facing restrictive policies. The fact that we actually had the highest level of international commencements, it's something that is quite remarkable. And I think we need to take a few seconds just to think about that and to really get some lessons out of that. I think it's also remarkable, not only because it's the record number of international commencements in higher education, but also because we had that high number of new students. That's also really helping the actual complete cohort of international enrollments. When we add the commencements, but also continuing students, the data from the Department of Education confirms that we had a 7% growth in enrollments in comparison to the previous year, which this is also Studymove, we estimate that is going to give an increase of 9% in aggregate revenue across the university sector. So a really, really positive result considering everything that happened in 2025. And I don't think that we had the time just to really think about that. And I just really want to congratulate and commend all the efforts done by education providers, in particular higher education providers, in keeping the engagement with market, keeping the actually changing a lot of protocols in terms of admissions and maintaining that efforts just to get those strong number of students. So I think that is very important that we just take a little bit of time just to thinking about the amount of effort that it was done just to reach that particular number. Now, that particular number also confirms something, which is the intention of the government of looking for a managed growth kind of a structure and a strategy across the sector. So it was not necessarily for the higher education sector, a set of policies that basically create a deep dive in the commencements. In fact, we just had a 1% growth, so basically the same numbers that we had in previous years. And that confirms the intention of the government of where are we going to move forward. In the next couple of years, it's most likely that the policy framework will continue looking for that very small, sustained growth in international commencements. And also confirms the intention of the government just to reshift the volume of students by sector. Basically look into what it has been called a high value students, and basically shifting students from maybe the ELICA sector or the VET sector into the higher education sector. By the way, that definition of high value students is one that I personally completely dislike, but that's the one that in the policy setting, it has been used just to identify how we are going. So we're looking for this managed growth, looking for high value group of students. And I think in 2025, we confirm that that's exactly what we are going. And we confirm because it's not only the announcement what confirm what it will happen. It also, you can announce whatever you want, but also it really is important just to understand how the market is actually reacting to this new value proposition. And as you can see, at least in the story of 2025, the applicants actually were in many, many ways continued engaging with Australia in the higher education sector and actually follow and maintain understanding what is the value of coming to study to Australia. So those three different factors have played an important role in this very interesting and important number of 214,000 commencements. And I think it's very important just to get some clarity that is these three players, the ones who are taking us to this highest level of international commencements. And I think it's very important also not only just to say that that number is remarkable itself, when you compare that with what other study destinations experienced in 2025, it's clear that where we are actually looking in the next couple of years is a slow growth in the next couple of years. If you compare to the results that are expected, this is preliminary, expected to have in the US in 2025, they are expecting to have a 17% decrease in commencements. In Canada, it's expected that it will be a decrease of nearly 40% on commencements. So very different approach, very different set of policies, and they're very different, the reaction of the market to that set of policies. The UK actually confirmed that had a 3% growth in basically what we can call commencements. And Australia also follows that path of low growth in the next couple of years with 1%. I would like just to mention the result for New Zealand, because I know that a lot of the New Zealand universities follow this set of data closely. And New Zealand actually is experiencing a very healthy recovery of 9.4% at the moment in 2025. They will confirm the official numbers, I think, in a couple of months. But I think this chart also shows the difference on how different set of policies, how different engagement from universities, and how different reaction from the market is providing a different result. So once again, I think that the fact that we reached this number, it shows quite a remarkable result. But it also shows some very interesting lessons. And I really want to just look into more detail of those lessons that we get from 2025. For me, probably the most important lesson is this one. I think that the number that we actually was reported for 2025 confirms that we're actually in a period when we're going to just see a small growth in commencements for higher education. So I think that for any institution that it's aiming to have double-digit growth in the next couple of years, I think that's going to be a very, very hard target to reach. I think that the policy has been creating just that sustained growth of commencements. And I think that we are going to head is a couple of years at least, probably more than a couple of years, of very small growth or flat level of commencements in the higher education in Australia. And I think that most of the universities are aware of that, but if not, I think it's important just to highlight that I think that's where we are heading, and I think the data show clearly that trend. Now, the second lesson that I think has been quite interesting when we look at the 2025 is once again to understand that on a restrictive set of policies, in still an active engagement from universities, what has been the response for different student cohorts? And the main difference that we see from 2025 data is in how bachelor student commencements versus postgraduate student commencements have been basically shifting. In terms of bachelor students, we actually had a 17% growth in comparison to last year. Just remember, we had overall a 1% growth, but for bachelor was 17%. But in contrast, the group that is not engaging, the group that is actually seeing that the current Australian value proposition is not what they want, is the postgraduate cohort, the mature age students. And that's the one that has been decreasing by 9% in comparison to last year. So I think this is a very important set of data to understand where are we going and what it has been the difference between the engagement and the results that probably you are experiencing in 2026, because we definitely have seen a big difference in how undergraduate students versus postgraduate students are reacting to this new set of policies. And I think that it's going to be important that we all have a conversation about how this is happening. But more importantly, I think highlights the importance just to have a specific set of strategies for the undergraduate market, which is different to the postgraduate market in many, many different ways. Now, from there also has been very important, and the 2025 data reminds us all this, that looking at annual numbers is very useful. But due to the big shift that we are seeing in markets and the changes that we are seeing, it's very important not only just to look at the annual data, but also at least to cut the data in what it was the result on the first half of the year and then the second half of the year. And in particular for Australia, this is important because we know that the effects of the NOSC allocation or delay on visas, because of the way in which the policy framework has been set up, may be affecting more second half of the year commencements than first half of the year commencements, because basically you reach probably your NOSC allocation in the second half of the year. Now, for bachelor students, when we actually dissect the data, as you can see, pretty much the same result, 18% more bachelors on the first half of the year, and then in the second half is 16. But definitely for postgrad, this is when we see the difference. And this is when I think it's going to be very important that we look at the data in a more timely manner, but also in a more detailed manner. Because if you look at the results of postgrad at the start of the year, it was only a 4% less reduction. But in the second one, that's when we had the big hit. It was 16% less on the second half of the year, and quite significant if you actually look into what it was the same period on the previous year. And the same effect happened also when we look at some specific markets. And let me show you this. This is at the top 5 markets in commencements for 2025. I'm going to not show China in a second, but let's just look in particular, for example, what happened with Nepal and Bangladesh. While at the first half of the year, these countries have a 14% growth, 30% growth, then it was a completely different shift. And in the second half of the year, we had 41% and 55% growth, which it was an extraordinary growth. And in some ways, there is a coincidence that this is actually the two particular markets where we have seen that rejection visas have been increasing. But anyhow, this is how quickly things are shifting in just 6 months. So in the past, looking at annual data was enough because the trend was actually quite soft and predictable. Now things are changing quite quickly. India actually has been quite stable, only 1% growth in the first half of the year and then 2% growth. Vietnam, unfortunately, also accelerates their decrease in the second half of the year. But look at China. China went completely 180 degrees a flip. When we actually had experience on commencements on the first half of the year, then bang, on the second half of the year, we actually had a very significant decrease of 17% on commencements. So this is important and shows that this shift in the market, in particular for China, didn't start in 2026, actually starting the second half of 2025. And once again, raise that very important aspect of looking at the data with the right periodicity and in a more timely manner so we can understand this big shift of the market. Something that we are talking to a lot of universities is how we can have access to more timely information so we can actually react instead of waiting for 6, 7, or 8 months and then look back and say, what happened? So it's very important just to see this because definitely has been big shift when you see different periodicities, and that's something that we need to take care of. So overall, there are some very important questions or lessons from 2025, and I invite you to take the time to really look at the data. As I said, it seems that now things are moving so quickly that we don't have the time just to look back, but definitely the fact that we had that high level of international commencements is something that I think the sector should celebrate because we are now on a restrictive policy framework. But more importantly, I think it shows where are we going to go in terms of the level of commencements that we will have in the next couple of years. We're not going to see any high growth, any big peaks in the level of commencements. I think we're definitely heading just to very flat levels in the next couple of years because that's where the policy framework has been building for the market. Also very important just to highlight this big shift in undergrad versus postgrad, something to put attention definitely. Unfortunately, universities that rely more in the postgraduate market, of course, have been affected more. And I think this is where the policy framework is actually affecting more the market. So it's very important just to look at those in more detail. And I think that is also very important, as I said, look at the numbers, not in an annual basis, but look at those different levels of periodicity, because definitely we have seen that things are moving faster than we have ever seen before. All right. So that's some of the lessons. I'm sure there are more, but we just want to highlight that just to put a little bit of perspective on what it has been the most recent data coming from 2026. And this actually came because we got a lot of universities saying, Keri, what can you see? We are really seeing that our FEB numbers were not what we were expecting. What actually is there that we can help us to understand, in particular, how we can actually respond, or what is just the assessment of this change, and how we can actually prepare for the rest of 2026. And on that, I think it's important just to look at, once again, these three main players in what basically is what creates the results for a university. In one hand, yes, the policy framework plays a very, very important role, and we know that. The last 24 months have shown us that. Also, how applicants are reacting currently is very important to look, but also very important how universities have been reacting and engaging just to either maintain the numbers or probably do something else that maybe has been seen or has been getting a good traction from the market, or probably not really. It's actually a barrier to engage more effectively with the market. And I'm highlighting this also because it seems that in the narrative of the sector at the moment, the main focus is still policy, 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 and we need to focus on what's the policy. First of all, I think we need to acknowledge that at the end of the day, yes, the policy plays a very, very important role and is obviously creating the frame where we actually operating. But there are other aspects that we need to consider. And there is one in particular that I'm going to highlight with you that I think is going to be probably as important as what the government is doing at the moment. So let me just go through each one of them and see what is the results or what we had at the moment in terms of 2026. Now, from a government perspective or from a policy framework perspective, there is a lot of commentary and a lot of things that we can talk about it. But overall, we pretty much have exactly the same policy framework that we had in 2025. Now, it's not Ministerial Direction 111, it's Ministerial Direction 115. So, but pretty much is the same set of restrictive set of policies that aim to have managed sustained growth across the sector. And once again, with a focus on this high value group of students, as it is called. As I said, I don't like the definition, but that's how, from a policy perspective, is what it's looking for. But something that behind the policy framework is happening, I think that we need to highlight a couple of things. The first one that I think is important to highlight is that in 2026, the government allocates 9% more NOSC to public universities. And that was very welcome by the universities. The fact that we have more spaces, I think, led universities to have more flexibility in the engagement with applicants. But unfortunately, this creates a noise in the messaging on the sector, in some areas of the sector. Because I think it's important to highlight that 9% more NOSCs doesn't mean 9% more commencements. The fact that we have 9% more seats in the theater doesn't mean that we're going to be able just to put everybody in those seats. So it was, I think, an expectation that because it was a growth of 9% of NOSC, it will be a 9% growth in commencements, which at this stage is very highly unlikely. And I think it's important just to highlight that many of you will be aware, but when we talk to some parts of the sector, there is this still kind of like relationship that people think that because I have more seats and because the government is giving us more seats, we're going to get 9% growth. It's not like that, as I've been saying, and as most of you know, there are market conditions, there is how universities are reacting, so all that plays a part in all this. Now, the other thing that I think is important to acknowledge, and I think many of you are aware of this, is that one of the issues that we have is not the actual architecture of the policy framework, is how the execution of the policy framework is actually affecting the recruitment efforts of many higher education providers. We know that there are inconsistencies in the assessment of candidates still. We don't know how many. We don't know if it's 100, 1,000, but we know that this is creating a disruption in the development of strategies. And I understand clearly the need for having clarity on what's the definition of a genuine student. And the sooner we get clarity on this, it will be for the benefit of everybody in the sector and of course for the benefit of its students. So that's the other one that is playing at the moment in 2026, definitely. But finally, one that we haven't really talked too much about it is that although the policy framework probably was not trying to achieve this, what is creating is a higher level of risk and exposure for universities. and a higher level of exposure to how offshore markets are actually reacting. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of the time explaining this because I think it's very important so we understand where the volatility that we are facing is coming from. So what happened is that traditionally in Australia, we had basically a sector that basically welcomed international students across any other subsector. Everybody was welcome to come to do an ELICOS, a BED, or a university program. And then we had this amazing partnership across the sector that allow students that while they were here in Australia, they were able just to continue their education journey through other sectors. So the best example is we had students who came to learn English, and after 6 months, they really liked the opportunity to study in Australia something further, so they will actually progress to other sectors. And that was actually one of the great aspects and great aspects of the value proposition of Australia, that flexibility and that openness. And that also helped the higher education sector because, in fact, as you can see on your screen, before COVID, about 45% of the students studying in higher education, they were already here in Australia and they came from other sectors. So this transfer from one sector to another, it was a very important part of the engagement with international applicants. Now that unfortunately changed in COVID because we had really not a lot of students coming onshore because the borders were closed, but also that continued when we had the implementation of the new policy framework. And the latest available data shows now that it's actually nearly 80%, basically 8 out of 10 students who actually come directly to higher education, and only about 20% that actually come from onshore moving into higher education. Now, I often get asked, and what's the problem with that, Keri? We're still getting 210,000 commencements. What's the problem? Well, there is a problem because that means that universities now need to rely more in the engagement with applicants who are outside of Australia, so the offshore market, that as we know is more competitive, it actually costs more to get the students from offshore. And also, we know that the students who are offshore, they still, because they haven't experienced what is to be in Australia, it's likely that probably are looking for other options. There is a compliance issues. At the end of the day, it's creating a higher level of exposure to the changes that it will exist in an offshore market. So basically, that's creating additional level of risk for universities in their international student recruitment strategies. And let me give you a very clear example of something that universities are facing at the moment. The best example is what happened with China. We know that a lot of universities, they have a report that their numbers for China in 2026 are actually going south. And they're going south because it was a very quick shift on the market, as I have been explaining, that it started in 2025. Now, universities are feeling this quicker than ever before because we don't have that onshore cohort that it was cushioning some of that level of volatility. And this is a very clear example of what it is. The Chinese students before COVID, only 39%, so close to a third of students, only came directly to higher education. The vast majority of Chinese students came from ELICOS or the other sectors. So most of them actually had that opportunity to come onshore and then actually progress to higher education. The latest available data actually shows a completely different story. Now it's 68% of students that come, Chinese students that come directly to higher education, and a significant reduction coming from other sectors, which is showing that now we are relying more and we are more exposed to those changes in the offshore kind of market for Chinese students. And that's why universities are actually feeling those changes quicker than ever before, because we don't have that very healthy onshore market of students that were progressing from one sector to another. We know that in one hand, now we have a very low number of students enrolled in other sectors, like ELICOS in particular. So basically the number of students that could progress to higher education, it actually has been reduced. But also we know that now the policy framework in many ways restrict that change from one sector to another. So in many ways, the policy framework, and that's what universities are facing, it's a high level of volatility due to the policy framework as well. Overall, and we talk about a few things about the policy framework, what I think is quite interesting is also just to take a little bit of time into see how we are going in 2026. And this is, again, looking at one of the big metrics that everybody likes to look, which is the number of student visas lodged and student visas granted. And all the information, once again, this is just for higher education. So what we are starting to look in 2026 is this. And I start with this chart, which is the monthly figures of student visas granted. And as you can see, we still have up and downs, big spikes in the monthly figures, which is making the analysis of visas granted and launched actually quite different. And I think that that's something that we have been highlighting in the past. Is volatile, the metric. So it's very important not only to look at one particular month, but trying to have a more of a medium-term trend that gives us a better understanding of where we at. So for that reason, something that we have been suggesting, and we do, our analysis is based on that, is not only looking at the monthly reported figures, but looking at the 6 months rolling average. When you actually look at the 6 months rolling average, which is basically the average of 6 months, so this is, for example, 16,819 that you see there. That's February, and then you go 6 months behind. What's the average? Then you go January, and so on. So that really helps you just to understand the actual trend of where we're facing. And as you can see, what I think is quite interesting is that overall, the actual trend in student visas granted is pretty stable. And this actually correlates with that stability and the number of student commencements. So basically what we are expecting is that at this stage, we will aim in, or we will probably, the higher education sector will reach probably the same number of commencements that we had in the last year. If you actually look at the actual number, our analysis basically at the moment is in -1%. So a little bit soft, but I will say pretty much flat, pretty much at the same levels. But I think it's important that for a good analysis, we take away those big changes up and downs in the monthly figures and look at the 6 months rolling average. Now, on this big figure of -1%, which is basically the same number of visas granted in comparison to what we had last year, I really want to acknowledge that this is the big number. This is the aggregate number. And I really want to acknowledge that every university is facing differences in the recruitment strategies because we actually have a great level of volatility. So this is the overall number. And a good way or a good example of how different it could be the results by universities is when we look at this number of granted visas by location. Because overall, in terms of location of the applicant, it's -1%, but there is a huge surge in the number of visas granted for applicants in Australia. That's 25%. And then for applicants outside of Australia, it's completely the other story. It's -9%. And that's why when we talk to recruitment teams, when they go overseas, they're telling us, it's getting harder, Keri. How come you are actually saying is -1%? Well, it is actually -9% for offshore, but the overall number is -1%. So there are actually some nuances that we need to consider in how we're actually looking at the data. And of course, universities who have a higher engagement with applicants in Australia probably are actually seeing better conditions than universities that actually rely more in students who are actually offshore. So that's very important just to consider. And that's why looking at this in more detail is actually very important. But overall, it seems that we are going to get the same level of visas granted that we had in last year. Now, the one that actually has been changed a little bit is the actual number of visas lodged. This is the one that is not stable. In fact, actually, we have noticed that is actually getting soft quite a little bit. And you can see that on the chart. And this is when we starting to think that some applicants are withdrawing and not considering as much Australia as we had in the past. I think the market is actually reassessing what is the value proposition of Australia. And for some of those applicants, it's not what they were looking for. So at the moment, our analysis is about 6% less on visas lodged, which it doesn't seem like a lot. But if you think about this figure of 200,000 commencements, 6% is about 12,000 less commencements. So it is significant. It's something that we are going to keep at our eyes and see where we actually see this softness, and trying just to have a better understanding just to see if this corrects or not. So overall, that's the big picture that we have in terms of 2026. But as I said, what I think is interesting is not only just to focus on the effects of policies, not only looking at visas granted and not only looking at visas lodged. We know that the interaction of these three is the one that matters, and having a better understanding of how these three different factors could affect numbers is something that I think it's worth just to look in more detail. So let me just take a look at something that we have looked recently, and I think is actually getting a lot of our attention, because it seems that this rapid shift in the market is not only coming from how the policy framework is actually reshifting. And let me just take a little bit of water before we get into applicants. We're getting reports from a lot of universities telling us that applicants are now more savvy and informed as they have ever been before. They are telling us that when they go to recruit students in country and they talk to their parents or they talk to themselves in student fairs, they come with questions that they have never seen before. They are very well informed. In fact, one university was telling me that parents come with PowerPoint presentations saying, I want to go to your university, but I know that in comparison to your other ones, there are all these changes. So we really look into this and trying to understand what's happening. And the reality is that this is the result of how students are actually finding information nowadays. And I really want to take a little bit of time explaining this, because I remember, this is nearly 20 years ago, when I started working in this sector, I was in a master class from one of the big legends of the international education here in Australia, Rob Lawrence. And Rob explained us how about 20 years ago, students were actually following the decision-making process. And Rob did a lot of research on this and basically explains that back 20 years ago, international applicants, they had very limited access to information. So the first thing they used to do, it was to select their country that they would like to study. From there, they will actually choose the city, and then based on the options that will exist in that particular city, they will actually choose a program or a university. So it's a very straightforward, basically decision-making process, and based on the limited information that the students will have. Based on this is that a lot of the marketing campaigns and strategies that universities took to market were based on that. And if you think about it, for many, many years, an international student guide was exactly following this process. It was basically highlighting a country, then you turn the page, it will highlight the city, and then it will actually then highlight the programs offered by that university. Now, through the years, obviously, this process is getting more complex, and with technology, applicants are able just to consider other options, basically through search engine and study portals and things like the information that they could actually capture just to make the decision. But it has been clearly a massive, massive and rapid change that it's basically ongoing and has been experienced by universities due to technology and due to the use of AI. This is really changing everything. And this is when we actually see that applicants are more savvy than we have ever seen before, because with the use of AI, they're able just to compute very complex decision-making decisions and to find different options, not only for a country like Australia, but all around the world. And this is when I think we're going to be able to do a lot of work so we can actually learn how to engage with that in a more specific way. Now, if you think, hi, Keri, you're exaggerating, you're telling us this story. We heard that story about AI many times. Well, if you don't believe me, you are not alone. In fact, one of the issues that we have is that Australia, and in fact also New Zealand is there, is one of the countries that actually had one of the lowest level of adoption of AI and actually had one of the strongest negative sentiments or sentiments against AI in comparison to India and China, for example, where they are adopting AI as we have never seen before, and they are loving AI as we have never seen before. In fact, this article or this actually report from Ernst & Young that comes on an annual basis, and there's another really good one from the University of Melbourne that I'm more than happy just to share the link at the end of the session. But basically, they're telling us that AI is reaching that level in some countries of authority in their judgments and the information that they are providing. What AI is telling international applicants means a lot. And AI is really letting international applicants to look for other possibilities that probably they were not at their reach before. So with that in mind, we have been actually running a lot of prompts, a lot of modeling. Obviously, we are limited by the geolocation that we had, but definitely it's clear that this is really reshaping and affecting the market as much as the policy framework. And we need to be aware of this. And I know that universities, we have a very resilient and a very dynamic sector. So we're going to get a hold of this. But at the moment, it's something that's really affecting us. So let me give you a good example of something that we run a couple of weeks ago. So we have been doing this with different AI systems, and this is a good example. We actually said to AI, look, I'm a student that is in the last year of high school. It's expected this student to have a tier 1 university, is looking for a Bachelor of Information Technology abroad, is looking for a top 100, top 150 ranked universities where this student should go. Okay, so straight away, AI basically said, okay, this is, and I love the way in which this has been framed. Here is the candid reality of what's happening right now. And straight away, it's basically give us enough sentence just to move away from Australia and Canada, because this is not a good option for you. You know, AI tries to be a little bit objective, but in certain ways, basically, that's what it's framing. And in fact, straight away, basically saying, the best place that you should go is go to Hong Kong. If you want to have the Western alternative, go to the UK. And if you want to have a budget-oriented idea, go to Malaysia. Now, this is an example, and I highly encourage you just to do your own research about this and run these prompts in the same way for many different examples. But I think what is important is just to take a moment just to think about this and think about how probably a year or 2 years ago, I don't imagine a student or international applicant from China going to an agent and getting all these options, or basically saying, why don't you go to Hong Kong? Why don't you go to Malaysia? It's opening the spectrum of possibilities to students as have never been before. And as I said, it's sometimes a little bit hard for us to understand because we are not adopting AI at the pace that some countries are adopting. And we are not using AI with that level of authority as some of those countries are doing. But this is definitely a big shift. And this is something that is making this quick change in student preferences. And I don't want to get into, this is not just to say everything is gone. And no. But this is the reality. And we're going to have to work. There are a lot of things that can be done to really bring back into the mix what it's Australia, or the attractiveness of Australia as a study destination. But we need to start being aware of how this is changing and how international applicants are actually seeking information nowadays. Very different to what happened, I see it's probably 2 years ago, and then, before that. So just is important just to highlight that with you. And I'm highlighting this because I insist, I understand completely the level of disruption that it was created by the policy framework. And there's still a lot of work that has to be done. But unfortunately, we're actually dealing with other things in the market that had to be considered. And this is when as institutions, I think we are all facing a challenge because, as we know, I do know that this is a sector that is quite dynamic, and we will catch up with all this. But the reality is that institutions, in particular universities, their response to market changes is always lagging based on the structural way in which we do things, based on the way in which we actually put together protocols. So I think we need to be aware of this so we can understand that things are moving quicker as we have seen before, and we probably need to tune some of those strategic responses to align more to what is the changes in the market. And a good example of that is what we have seen in terms of fees. We're actually going to have a really, really good session on Thursday. You're all welcome to come. We're going to talk about, in particular, pricing strategies for Australian universities. If you can come, you can get the recorded version as well. There's no problem. But this year, we actually identify, and it's a clear example of how there is a lagging understanding of market conditions when universities in particular make their decision. Let me just show you this chart that explains this. We collect data from all programs offered by Australian universities, and we have been doing this for the last 10 years. It's one of the most comprehensive analyses of fees that we have here in Australia. We also do it for New Zealand as well. So every year we actually look at what is the average increase on annual international fees across all universities. So basically we look at how universities increase their fees, and then we get an average. Now, what happens is that most of the time, universities set their fees sometimes 1 year behind or sometimes 2 years behind. So in the past, that worked well because market conditions didn't change that much. But unfortunately, now it is very, very hard just to basically guess what are going to be the market conditions in 12 months. So sometimes these decisions do not align to the market conditions. So for example, in 2019, we saw an increase of 5.1%. So the decision of that increase was made a year behind, probably. So in 2018, actually, was a great level of optimism in the Australian market, and the university's response thinking, it will be higher demand, we can actually charge higher fees. In 2020, for example, the fees were set the year before when we didn't know that COVID was coming, but it was a little bit of a softness on the demand back in those days. So still universities, they actually had an average growth of 4.3%. Then during COVID, we knew that market conditions were not great. So basically, was no increase in fees. In 2023, the start of the quick recovery, universities were not that optimistic yet. So it was an increase of 3.5%. And then since then, it has been growth of about 5% in general. Now, this year, I personally expect that in general, the university sector was still going to take a conservative approach, but I was wrong. In fact, we actually had the highest increase in the average annual international fee. And these increases that they don't seem big, I think we need to put it in context because the students are paying $80,000, $150,000 for a service, for an educational service. So small increments, they mean a lot in dollar amounts. And the fact that universities actually report this show a great level of optimism that unfortunately, or a great level of financial needs that unfortunately is not necessarily aligning to what are the market conditions. So as important is to understand the policy framework, as is important to understand the response of the market, it's also important just to try to align as much as possible to what are the market conditions so we get the right outcome for our institutions. And I just want to finish with this a screenshot from a post of that came from IDP. I am so grateful, and I've been saying this for years, that we in the sector, we have access to this information. This is from Emerging Futures 8 from IDP, which is a large survey to prospective students. I know that QS also have the International Student Survey School. I know Austrade, so all that has been extremely useful. But this one in many ways illustrates what I'm trying to say. So it talks about why students around the world in general, they are actually not longer going to study abroad. And it's highlighting something that is clear. It's 20% of students, they said student visas are actually too expensive. And also actually highlights that 1 in 5, 20%, they said is difficult to get in student. But also highlights the other side of the market conditions. In fact, students are telling us and have been saying for a couple of years that the cost of studying in Australia is actually pretty high. And it seems that also, not only from a policy framework, but at least from how the market is reacting, but also how applicants are finding other opportunities like Hong Kong and Malaysia, and that's being given by AI, we're starting to reach a little bit of a ceiling. And until we get a better hold of how this is changing, and this is actually rapidly affecting the way in which we actually operating, I think that what we're going to see is that universities are going to actually take a step back and take a more conservative financial outlook. I think that because of all these rapid changes, a lot of the targets for reaching international students, they're not going to be able to be met. And I think this is going to be a good lesson for everybody just to be more conservative because there is a lot on. Just simply the rise of AI, something that is going to take a couple of years just to understand how we're going to manage that. And by the way, there are ways to manage that. But also, I think that it's going to be also a greater focus in risk and ways in which we can reduce volatility. So market diversification is something that most likely will be back in the agenda, and it will be considered because markets can actually shift in one day. So now we actually need to have a more diverse student cohort and program cohort just to minimize the exposure to risk. But I also think that more and more we're going to see universities understanding that having access to a good data that help us just to understand those changes are going to be very, very important. So investment in strategic foresight is likely that is going to be also important in the way in which we actually move forward, because that's the way in which you can actually manage a volatile market that is rapidly shifting the results that everybody's aiming to get. So I hope that this helps. I know this is probably just a few things out of many, many different ideas that you may have, but we thought it was very important just to support the sector with sharing what we are currently seeing and hoping that as I said, complements your own institutional analysis. I think that there is a lot that we will still learn, and we'll keep our eye and we'll keep you posted. As I said, we're going to have a session on Thursday that everybody's welcome to come. If you want to get more information and you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. But in the meantime, once again, really, really thankful for joining this session. Anyhow, you'll have my email. In the meantime, thanks so much for joining, and we'll be in touch soon again. Take care. See you. Bye.